My vote's for feminism, Kyle. I'm all in on feminism. DarbyCast Wildcard Friday. Kyle and I, we were just talking about what's going to be a bigger disaster in the long term. That train whodunit in Ohio, where their idea of damage control was to set the whole thing on fire and let it burn off. So different. Or feminism. And I'm voting for feminism. Am I going to tell you why I'm voting for feminism? No, I'm not. Because it's so patently obvious that I'm not going to waste your time. But it's DarbyCast, it's Wildcard Friday, and if you're new here, this is your opportunity to get lost. Eject. Avoid stepping in to a really good time. And self-assess a little bit. If you're in the car, maybe you pull over, you look at yourself in the rear view mirror and you say, am I a coward? And if the answer is yes, this podcast is not for you. But if you make hard eye contact, unbroken eye contact with yourself, and feel compelled to shout, you're a hero. If you're courageous, an inspirational figure with a decent body and a really good attitude, chances are you belong here, and we're happy to have you. Let's get some administrative stuff out of the way. Why don't we, Kyle? The DarbyCast is changing. This will be the last episode that is comped gratis on the house. From here on out, the episodes will cost you a couple bucks a month, but that will allow Kyle and I to continue eating food and living indoors, which we both enjoy. We've been putting this off for a long time, have we not, Kyle? But I think the people who know and love this show would be more than happy to step up and support our endeavors. And I will promise you that with subscriptions comes excellence. Kyle hasn't been showing up to work a little bit. Kyle, I'm going to tell people about it. Kyle's been eating peanut butter sandwiches. No knock on peanut butter, but peanut butter should be a change-up and not your fastball. Kyle, better times ahead. Kyle's going to go ahead and put the link to the subscription in the description of the episode. Subscription in the description, Kyle. But yeah, there's a lot going on in the world right now. And you know what that means for us. We're not going to focus on any of it. Boom, gotcha. You walked right into that. Ambushed by a tastefulreprieve.com. If you're a DarbyCast doctor and you've been listening to this show for quite some time, people count on you in a huge way. And that's kind of a chicken or the egg. Who done it? Did they count on you beforehand? Therefore, the DarbyCast made sense to you? Or did you start listening to the DarbyCast and all of a sudden heroism became part of your fabric, part of your tapestry? Neither Kyle nor I care whether you pulled a commute or a reverse commute to the destination. But I get it. There's a lot going on. People count on you, and you need to have your tank topped up. And some of you know where I'm going with this because you're geniuses. But for those of you who don't know, it's time to talk about German folklore of the 1800s. You better believe it. The Brothers Grimm, great guys. And today we're going to be dipping our toes into a story that's one of their most famous ones, Kyle. Surprising that we've saved this one this late in the game. However, we're just going to jump right in. For some of the rookies listening to this, the neophytes, the DarbyCast doctors in residency, so to speak, just know that this is something that we do from time to time, dating back to episode 30 called The Miller's Hot Daughter, which was about Rumpelstiltskin, that 3-foot-tall creep. Not okay. But we have explored a lot of the Grimm's fairy tales, and aren't they just mines of meaning waiting for the drill that is our enthusiasm to pull out the precious resources that are the messages? But without further ado, let's talk about Snow White. First published in 1812 by the Brothers Grimm. Good guys, smart guys. The original German title was Sneewittchen, right, Kyle? It was later modified to Schneewittchen. Nice little upgrade. And many of us have heard this story before, but we were probably a lot younger, naive, not understanding what was really going on. But that's why, as doctors, we're going in for a little. Whether you've heard this story before or not, that is of little consequence, because this version is going to be fucking diesel. Let's get into it. Our story begins with a queen sitting at a sewing station at an open window during a winter snowfall. There's birds around, the right amount of birds. It's not overwhelming. However, there is one bird that's whistling a tune that's distractingly beautiful, which causes the queen to make a sewing error. Error, Kyle. Causes 3 drops of red blood to drip on the freshly fallen white snow on the black windowsill. The queen says to herself, "How I wish I had a daughter that had skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony." Odd thing to say out loud. Typically that would be kind of a private thought. But she's not hoping for a black baby. Fast forward a year or two. The queen gets pumped quite a few times by the king. And he leaves that puppy in there, which results in pregnancy. Now let's pause for a second and celebrate that. The physical act of love in a committed marriage. Not bad. The queen wasn't just drunkenly wandering around town, going into random ale houses and saying, "Buy me a beer and I'll give you a slob J." Times were quite a bit classier back then. But the queen is pregnant and gives birth to this baby, Snow White. But then tragedy strikes, and the queen dies at the tail end of the birthing process. A year later, Snow White's father, the king, meets his new chick. She's good looking, but she's vain, she's wicked, and she practices witchcraft. No thanks, right, Kyle? Boy, have you seen gals on the internet these days? Witches, self-proclaimed witches? Boy, do they need to be burned at the stake, like yesterday. And let me just add, as a metaphor to that comment, to keep things on the level, let's zoom out and get a high-level view of what this gal's about. She has a magic mirror, and every morning she asks the mirror, "Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" And the mirror always tells the queen that she's the fairest. The queen's pretty pleased with that, but that vaults us into tackling an issue that still exists in the world. People have a hard time of self-affirming. Why couldn't she have just looked in a regular mirror and said, I look pretty good? That lane's open. Internal locus of validation. Snow White turns 7 years old, and cue the biggest disaster of the stepmom's entire life. Snow White's fairness surpasses that of her stepmom. That seems a little young to analyze the attractiveness of anybody, Kyle. But it's not a person who's analyzing it. It's this godforsaken dark magic mirror, who we're now learning is a pervert. But the queen asks her mirror the industry standard question, and she's like, hey, who's the hottest chick around? And the mirror, pedophile, says that Snow White she's it. And the queen's pissed, when really that should have communicated to her that this magic mirror was either broken or evil or both, but she buys in on it. If you're getting outshined by a 7-year-old or even drawing comparisons, boy, are you a fucking screwball. Not okay. But her heart turns to stone as it relates to her stepdaughter. So the queen takes the sloppy, inappropriate analysis of her sinister mirror and becomes pretty envious of her stepdaughter, which grows into hate. Envy breeds hate. It's not healthy admiration. It is filthy envy. How much do you just not trust adult women who don't have children of their own? Kamala Harris comes to mind, Kyle. Very off-putting. Bet you she does dark magic in her spare time as well. She's got the cackle for it, right? Cackleofawitch.com. Kyle, buy it. So the queen's pretty rattled, and she orders a huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. She's not even worried about Snow White taking the throne or anything like that. It's really petty. She's like, oh, you're going to grow up to be prettier than I am, so you got to go. Now, in the text, it doesn't say that she's a wine-guzzling cat owner, but boy, isn't she acting like one. So spiteful. So negative. Queen also tells the huntsman, bring back my stepdaughter's heart so I can eat it and become immortal. What books is she reading? She is just the Michael Jordan of basketball, of baseball, of discerning the difference between a good idea and a bad idea. What a mess. How did she become this way? What makes a woman such a crazy harpy? You think she was always this way? Going around as a youth, terrorizing small animals, as psychopaths do? Playing hacky sack with a rabbit's heart so she can expeditiously augment her potion-making skills? Kyle? What I'm trying to say is you don't just wake up on the wrong side of the bed one morning and say, I want to kill my stepdaughter and eat her heart. That comes from a lifetime of abuse. Hurt people, Kyle. What happened to her? Who was the person who encouraged her to play hacky sack with a rabbit's heart in the first place? No kid has that idea, unless they are a cold-blooded psycho, in which case nobody could have done anything to save her. In fact, the most benevolent act you can do for a psycho like that is throw him off a bridge. In the 1800s, Germans knew this. Most societies have known this for a long time, that you take psychos and boy do you hurt them until they're dead. Forever. But this one fell through the cracks. And now look what she's doing. Kyle. Very concerning. So Snow White is going out into the forest with this huntsman, and they go pretty far into the forest, and he raises a big old knife, and he's about to plunge it into her face, but then he doesn't. What a relief. Snow White, a child, is pretty unsettled by the near homicide, and she starts crying, and the huntsman's like, all right, listen, your stepmom wanted me to do this. She is so nuts. What a great guy. He understands that whatever the queen was going to pay him, is not worth the price of his soul. He allows Snow White to run off into the woods. Really high ethics play. The huntsman, intent on making $10 or so, kills a boar, rips out its heart, and makes his way back to the castle. And I endorse that. The queen is evil through and through, so nothing that one could do to her is out of bounds. In fact, it's beyond morally justifiable. After wandering through the forest for quite some time, Snow White discovers a tiny cottage belonging to a group of 7 dwarves. Just a little dwarf frat house. Tiny people, big parties. Nobody's home. Snow White decides to let herself in. A little breaking and entering. She eats some of their tiny meals, which are actually huge on flavor. Drinks some of their wine. Not okay. 7-year-olds should not be drinking wine. Kyle, there's been no real passage of time, has there? She tests all the beds in the house for their comfort factor. She finds a suitable bed and takes a little snooze-magoose. The dwarfs come home. Kyle, dwarfs or dwarves? Either is correct. I don't think that's true. The 7 little fellas return home. They immediately say to each other, hey, so what the hell's going on here? Because their home is a little bit disheveled. It's not the way they left it. They feel violated. This is how a lot of rational people feel about something like illegal immigration. What are you doing here? Where are you? The dwarves feverishly search the house for clues. And they find the human clue that is Snow White taking a nap. She wakes up and explains to the guys. She says, my stepmom paid a guy to stab me in the face. My life is not the most together. And the dwarves step up. And they say, you can stay with us if you become our housemaid. And what a great call that is. 7 bros, no dwarf housekeeping services in the region. This chick's having a rough go of it. All the pieces align. These guys are amazing. They tell her, hey, be careful in the house when we're mining precious metals. That's what we do. We're dwarves. And she says to them, what does she say, Kyle? She says, you guys aren't the biggest, but I like you a lot. And boy, did they need to hear that. Bunch of short kings. These squat little fellas have probably not received a compliment in well over a decade. How far can a simple compliment go, Kyle? Let's keep that in mind for the rest of our lives. Snow White grows up into a lovely, fair, and beautiful young maiden. One day, the queen, total bitch, asks her creepy mirror, who's who? The mirror calls it out, says, it's Snow White. You are a silver medal of a person, queen. A lot of you right now are rightfully wondering, how did a decade or so pass without the mirror calling it out? And I think that's pretty obvious. Snow White went through some awkward teenage years. It's called growing up. I was an unsightly adolescent, Kyle. So the day the magic mirror called it out was probably the day that Snow White's acne was all cleared up. The evil mirror also says that Snow White's hiding with the dwarves. Queen is livid, and she says, okay, I'm going to kill this girl myself. The queen uses magic and disguises herself as an old peddler, goes to the cottage and offers Snow White colorful, silky, laced bodices as a present. Bodices? Kyle, am I saying that right? The queen laces her up so tightly that Snow White faints, but the dwarves return just in time to revive Snow White by loosening the laces. Next, the queen dresses up as a comb seller. We all know how they dress. This crafty psycho laces one of her combs with poison and says, "Hey, Snow White, can I tempt you with a little hairbrush? Let me show you how this thing works." Snow White's a little bit country. She's a little bit naive. She hasn't really had to deal with a ton of crooked people since she was 7. Most people would be able to shut this down pretty quick. You're a comb salesman? What other items do you sell? You cannot make a living just selling combs. That's insane. That's what somebody with a little bit more life experience would say in that situation. They'd also say, "Yeah, I know how a comb works. I don't need you to brush my hair for me." A good question to ask a traveling comb salesman: what are you doing out this far? This is a remote cottage. This is not a major commerce center. Sales cannot be high for you if you're just wandering around in these sparsely populated woods. What is your business plan like? Because it's garbage. Snow White didn't say any of these things. She allows the queen to comb her hair. And I'm not quite sure how a poison comb works, but it worked. And Snow White collapses into a heap. But guess who shows up? High ethics short kings. They revive her. And in the text, it doesn't say how. But I, like you, get the sense that it was probably with some of the most amazing clarinet music that anybody had ever heard. That'll put some pep in your step, right, Kyle? This absolute psychopath, the queen, is going back in for round 3. She dresses up as a farmer's wife and goes back again. This time she's got the famous poison apple. And aren't we all just rooting for Snow White's street smarts to kick in? Somewhere along the lines of, I haven't seen a single person in a decade, and now 3 days in a row, I have a symphony of sideways hucksters trying to sell me crap. What is this even about? That doesn't register with her. And that's unfortunate. But this also speaks to her good nature and big heart. She's happy to connect with others. And you know who would have been the perfect leader to handle all this? That's right, her dad. Had he known this was all going down, you better believe that's a musket blast to the kneecaps of the queen so she could fit into a wooden barrel and then be launched via trebuchet into a lake. And then an archer with flaming arrows hits the barrel, and the queen doesn't know how to swim. Plus, she's missing a healthy portion of her legs. And then some giant hawks drop rocks on her as she's feebly trying to tread water. She was going to die anyway, but those hawks wanted to send a message. That's how these German folklore tales go. I couldn't spell that out like I just did if I weren't familiar with the literature. But dads protect their daughters. The dwarves are great guys, right? But you can't replace an active father in his daughter's life. The dwarves are great. The dwarves are helpful. They are not father figures. The dwarves don't have dad vibes. They have bro vibes. They like mining for copper, and that's it. While other dwarves have gone out and gone after gold and silver, these guys have totally cornered the market on copper. Very cagey business play, Kyle. To briefly summarize, you cannot replace a biological father and all that he brings to his children's lives. Back to Snow White. She takes a bite of the poison apple, instantly falls into a coma. And the queen's pretty fired up. She thinks Snow White is dead. She has gone to great lengths to secure the beauty endorsement of a demon-possessed mirror. How does she not see where this is going, right? How long is she going to keep this up, going around? Let's say she did kill Snow White. Okay. A couple years later, new hot chicks showing up. This is a losing game. What kind of a life is that? Just putting on various disguises of traveling salespeople selling wooden mallets and chicken wire and other random crap in the name of murdering women? What a lifestyle. My goodness. The dwarves get home. They see Snow White in her state, and they think that she's dead, so they put her in a glass casket, which I believe is pretty uncommon. But they decide to put on a funeral, do things right. The next day, a prince stumbles upon what looks like a dead chick in a glass coffin when he's having a hunting trip. The prince hears the story from the dwarves, and he says, this glass coffin thing, guys, it's artsy, but I don't think this isn't right. Let me take her off your hands. I'm going to take her back to her father's castle. The dwarves say, okay, we got copper to mine. You got it. The prince and some of his homeboys are transporting Snow White back to her father's castle, and all of a sudden, in transport, one of the prince's servants trips and loses his balance. Probably has terrible core strength. This dislodges the piece of the poisoned apple from Snow White's throat, magically reviving her. I don't know how much magic there is there, Kyle. I think that's kind of an improv Heimlich maneuver. The prince is overjoyed, and he says to Snow White, he says, wow, how about you? What do you say? Should we get married? Pretty quick off the draw, but I guess when you know, you know. The prince invites everyone in the kingdom to the wedding, except for Snow White's stepmom, who was too busy drop-kicking babies in a field somewhere and couldn't be bothered. After some major kicks to some infants, the queen was tuckered out. So she went to her magic mirror and she said, hey, who's hot? And the mirror says that there is a bride of a prince, and she is a smoke. And the queen decides to go visit the wedding uninvited. Very classless. Queen shows up and finds out who the bride is. But the prince sees what's going on. The stepmom's telegraphing it. There's no subtlety to her. She's in a blind rage, and she's like, you! Blows her cover. They apprehend the queen, and as a wedding gift to Snow White, the prince orders the queen to wear a pair of red-hot iron slippers and dance in them until she drops dead. And then the wedding continues. The end. Incredible. So there's a lot of major takeaways that we have from this. Nobody's going to look after a gal better than their father or their husband. You just cannot match those things. Dwarves, short fellas, can show up in a big way. That's a major takeaway. What's another key message? All of this could have been avoided easily had the queen been identified as a youth to be a psycho, and then you just deal with her accordingly with violence. What's another takeaway? Witchcraft? Really inappropriate. What's another high-level takeaway, you're probably wondering? If you're a young lady, know that some older gals are pretty jealous of you and that you might want to be careful around them. They might be aligned with the devil, so you got to stay vigilant. I can keep going with these themes because they were plentiful. Kyle, learn to recognize odd sales tactics. Nobody sells combs exclusively. Here's a little call out for the lady listeners. Start a family. Go have kids. What if the stepmom, the queen, what if she wasn't a psycho? What if she just didn't have kids and therefore had way too much time on her hands? And in that time, awful thoughts occurred to her. And nobody was there to pick her up and say, babe, I'm going to raw dog you, give you something to focus on. Yeah, we're going to throw out your disguise collection. I don't know what you've been working on, but Katrina, it's over. You have the weirdest hobbies and you're miserable. You tell me, Katrina, what sounds better? Playing with some children, your own children, or lovingly rubbing a 4-pound block of quartz to better understand the mysteries of teleportation? Now, the huntsman who was supposed to stab Snow White in the face towards the beginning of the story, we don't hear a whole lot about him. But what a great guy. And he got a new lease on life. He turned away from doing the wrong thing. It's never too late to do the right thing and not stab a kid in the face, as a metaphor. So let's celebrate that, Kyle. But we're going to land the plane on that. That's DarbyCast. That's Wildcard Friday. For those of you who are ready to get dialed in and support the process, the link will be available, and we're going to keep doing this thing.